The summer of '86 burned the life out of Dry Laurel. It came on a wind that tasted of grit and distance, a wind that scoured the juniper brakes until the very rocks seemed to gasp for water. Dust, fine as flour, settled on everything, coating the warped planks of the boardwalks and filming the windows of the mercantile. The sun was a merciless hammer in a brassy sky, beating down until the air itself felt brittle enough to snap. Thirst wasn't just a feeling. It was the smell of the baked earth, the silence of the cicadas, the grim set of a man's jaw as he stared down the length of the one street that gave the town its name. Behind the stockyards, where the stench of cattle and fear clung heavy in the heat, a canvas tent had been erected. It offered no real relief from the sun, only a concentrated pocket of sweat, cheap whiskey, and low murmurs. This was where the dregs of the territory came to bargain. A crowd of men ranch hands, drifters, and a few sour-faced merchants formed a loose, shuffling circle. In the center, on a platform of hastily assembled crates, stood a man whose smile didn't reach his eyes. He was selling off the contents of a foreclosed wagon train. But the main event, the one that had drawn the hushed, expectant crowd, was what he called a human bill of sale. Lydia Vale stood beside him. She was 23, though the harsh lines of exhaustion and fear etched around her mouth and eyes made her look older. Her lips were cracked like sun-baked clay, and her calico dress, once a cheerful blue, was now a uniform of dust and despair. Her hands, bound loosely in front of her with a length of coarse rope, trembled not from the heat, but from a cold that had settled deep in her bones. She kept her gaze fixed on a tear in the canvas wall, refusing to meet the assessing, hungry eyes that roamed over her. "What am I bid for this indenture?" the auctioneer called out, his voice slick with false bonhomie. He held up a piece of paper, a flimsy document that claimed ownership of another person's future. A strong worker. This one, docile. Bill of sale is clean. Witnessed by the law in the next county over. Good for 10 years' service. Let's start the bidding at $20. A low chuckle went through the crowd. Men shifted, their boots grinding on the dirt floor. Someone called out, "$25, and the auctioneer's smile widened. Gabe Harrow stood at the back of the crowd, half hidden in the shadows where the tent met the blinding glare of the afternoon. He was a tall man, built of the quiet strength that comes from a life of hard work and solitude. His face was weathered by the sun and wind of the Painted Fox River country, where his ranch lay nestled against the foothills. He had come to Dry Laurel for salt licks and barbed wire, not to witness this quiet atrocity. But the sounds from the tent had pulled him in, and now he watched, a cold, hard knot tightening in his gut. He saw the slight tremor in the woman's hands, the rigid set of her shoulders, the fierce, desperate pride in the way she refused to look at her tormentors. "30!" another voice shouted. 35 from the gentleman in the checkered vest? Gabe didn't move. He listened to the bids climb, each one a nail being hammered into the woman's coffin of a life. The men here weren't just bidding on labor. He saw it in their eyes, the cruel speculation, the possessive glint. They were bidding on the right to break her spirit, to own her fear. The knot in his stomach turned to ice. $50, the man in the vest crowed, puffing out his chest. The auctioneer looked around, his gaze sweeping the tent. $50 going once. Gabe pushed away from the tent pole. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the humid air with the sharp authority of a rifle shot. $100. A hush fell over the tent. Every head turned towards him. The auctioneer squinted, surprised. The man in the vest deflated, his face turning a blotchy red. $100 was a steep price for an indenture. More than most of these men saw in half a year. It was the price of a prime bull, or a small herd of horses. It was a price that said, "This is over." The auctioneer recovered quickly. $100 from the rancher. Do I hear 110, 100 going once? Twice. He slammed a dirty palm down on a crate. "Sold to the man from the Painted Fox River." Gabe stepped forward, his face unreadable. He ignored the resentful stares and laid 10 gold eagles on the crate. He took the bill of sale without looking at it and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He turned to Lydia, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were the color of a stormy sky, filled with a terror so profound it was almost silent. He gave a curt nod. "Let's go." The ride out of Dry Laurel was silent. Gabe handled the reins of his wagon, the horses plodding steadily through the deep dust. Lydia sat beside him, rigid, her hands now untied, but clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. She stared straight ahead, watching the endless, shimmering expanse of the prairie unfold before them. The wagon wheels groaned, a mournful sound in the vast stillness as the last wretched shacks of the town disappeared behind them. She finally spoke. Her voice was a dry, rasping whisper, the sound of splintering wood. "You've paid for me. Just do it." Gabe's hands tightened on the leather reins. The words struck him with a physical force, a sickening jolt that went straight through him. He had thought he understood the horror of her situation. He was wrong. He hadn't understood the depth of it, the absolute destruction of hope that made her assume the very worst of him. That made her invite it just to get it over with. He pulled the horses to a halt beside a crumbling stone well, the last landmark before the open range stretched to the horizon. He looped the reins and jumped down from the wagon seat. For a moment, he just stood there, the dust settling around his boots, the immensity of her brokenness washing over him. He walked around to her side of the wagon. She flinched as he reached up, her eyes shutting tight. Gently, he placed his hands on her waist and lifted her down. Her body was stiff with fear, but she was lighter than he expected, as if her ordeal had hollowed her out. He set her on her feet and stepped back, giving her space. "There's water," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He worked the creaking handle of the well pump, and after a few labored groans, a stream of cool, clear water gushed into the stone basin. He rinsed a tin dipper and offered it to her. Lydia stared at it, then at him, her expression a mask of confusion and suspicion. He saw the mind behind her eyes working, trying to understand this new, unexpected turn. What kind of man pays a fortune for a woman only to offer her water? Slowly, as if expecting a blow, she took the dipper. She drank greedily, the water spilling down her chin and soaking the front of her grimy dress. When she was done, she handed it back, her eyes still wary, still watching him with the desperate caution of a hunted animal. Gabe met her gaze directly. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and steady. "I didn't buy that paper for what you think. I bought it so no one else could. No one's laying a hand on you here. You're safe." Lydia said nothing. She simply watched him, her breathing shallow. The word safe seemed to hang in the air between them, a foreign concept she no longer knew how to trust. The rest of the journey to the ranch passed in that same thick silence. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, they arrived at his homestead. It was a simple, sturdy-looking cabin made of hewn logs, with a wide porch and a stone chimney. A corral stood nearby, and the scent of pine and clean earth replaced the dust of the plains. Gabe tended to the horses while Lydia stood uncertainly by the wagon. When he was finished, he led her to the porch. He gestured to a wooden bench. "Sit, I'll make some coffee." Soon, the rich, comforting aroma of brewing coffee mingled with the smell of saddle leather from the gear hanging on the porch wall. Gabe brought out 2 tin mugs and set one down on the bench beside her, keeping a respectful distance. He leaned against a porch post, sipping his own. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was no longer the silence of fear and uncertainty, but a quiet space, a pause, as the first stars pricked the deep velvet of the twilight sky. That shared silence, filled with the simple, honest smells of a working ranch, began to say more than words ever could. Dawn arrived not as a gentle light, but as a spill of red dust across the eastern horizon. The wind that had slept through the short, cool night stirred again, lifting the fine soil from the plains and painting the air with a hazy, copper glow. Gabe was already up, the smell of strong coffee and frying bacon a welcome anchor in the vast, empty landscape. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet competence that seemed as much a part of him as the weathered lines around his eyes. When Lydia emerged from the small room, he had given her a space that held little more than a narrow cot and a wash basin. She found a plate of food waiting on the rough-hewn kitchen table. She ate in silence, her movements still tentative, as if she were a guest in her own body. The fear had receded from the forefront of her eyes, replaced by a deep, abiding weariness and a cautious watchfulness. After the meal, Gabe led her not to the cabin, but to the corral. The air was alive with the smell of horses and hay, the soft snorts and stomping hooves a constant, living rhythm. He picked up a length of rope. "You'll need to know this," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, not demanding. He showed her a bowline knot, his large, calloused hands moving with a practiced grace. He made her practice it over and over, his patience unwavering as her clumsy fingers fumbled with the stiff rope. "It's a knot you can trust your life to," he explained. "It won't slip." The words hung in the air, meaning more than just the rope. Next, he showed her how to properly bandage a hand, using a clean strip of cloth. "Wire and splinters have a way of finding you out here," he said, wrapping her own hand gently to demonstrate. His touch was firm but impersonal, the touch of a teacher, not a captor. He worked a salve that smelled of pine and herbs into the raw rope burns on her wrists. His gaze focused on the task. For Lydia, who had known only brutal, grasping hands for weeks, the simple, respectful contact was both unnerving and profoundly soothing. There was a young filly in the corral, a nervous, high-strung creature with a wild eye. Gabe approached it slowly, making soft, crooning sounds. He showed Lydia how to stand, how to breathe, how to let the horse scent her before she ever reached out a hand. "They feel everything," he murmured, his breath misting in the cool morning air. "Stay calm in your own heart, and they'll find a reason to trust you." Lydia watched, mesmerized, as the filey lowered its head and nudged Gabe's shoulder. She was learning more than ranch chores. She was getting her first lesson in how to reclaim a space in the world without fear. The days settled into a routine. Lydia began to move about the homestead with a hesitant purpose. She walked the perimeter of the corral, her steps growing steadier. She learned to sweep the cabin floor, the simple, repetitive motion a balm to her frayed nerves. Every action was awkward at first, the muscle memory of a normal life buried under layers of trauma. But with each passing day, the haunted look in her eyes receded, replaced by a flicker of focus. She was a wilting plant being given water and sun, slowly, tentatively, beginning to uncurl. The cabin was Gabe's world, and it spoke of the man he was. It was sparse but clean, everything in its place. There were books on a shelf, not just the Bible, but volumes on animal husbandry, geology, and even a worn copy of Shakespeare. But one object drew her curiosity more than any other, a heavy, iron-banded chest that sat at the foot of his bed. It was always locked. One afternoon, while looking for a sewing needle to mend a tear in her dress, she saw him open it. He was taking out a fresh ledger, and for just a second, the lid was up. Lydia caught a glimpse of something inside, something that glinted in the dim light, a tarnished, star-shaped badge, the kind the old Texas Rangers wore. Before she could get a better look, he had seen her, and his face, usually so placid, became shuttered and distant. He closed the lid with a soft, final click, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of the room. He didn't say a word, and she knew not to ask. The chest held a past he was not ready to share. News from the outside world arrived infrequently, usually carried by a traveling tinker or when Gabe made a necessary trip for supplies. It was on one of these trips that he returned with more than just flour and salt. His jaw was set in a hard line. He told her the rumors circulating in Dry Laurel. They were about a gang called the Bramble Riders, led by a ruthless man named Silas Mott. They were known for their cunning and their cruelty, but their specialty, the one that made men spit when they said the name, was their trade in human contracts. They worked the lonely stretches of the territory, acquiring people through debt, deceit, or brute force, and selling their indentures through a network that stretched as far as the Night Creek stagecoach station. The name Silas Mott meant nothing to Lydia, but the description of their methods sent a chill of recognition down her spine. That evening, Gabe did something that shifted the very foundation of their silent arrangement. He took the bill of sale from his jacket, the filthy piece of paper that had declared her to be property, and placed it squarely in the middle of the kitchen table. He didn't hide it or destroy it. He left it there, exposed in the lamplight, a testament to the crime that had been committed against her. It was a promise, she realized, as solid and unspoken as the mountains on the horizon. He would not simply forget this. He would face it. He would undo it. Not with a match, but with the law. The paper sat there between them, an ugly scar they now shared. Their lives became a quiet duet of labor. While he was out mending fences, the rhythmic thud of his post driver would carry on the wind, a steady, reassuring heartbeat. Inside the cabin, Lydia found a stack of old burlap sacks that needed stitching. The simple task of pulling a needle and thread through the coarse fabric focused her mind. Their parallel work became a language. The clang of his hammer on the anvil at the forge was a conversation. The neat, strong line of her stitches was a reply. They were two people rebuilding their worlds, side by side. The shared cadence of their work, a bridge across the chasm of their experiences. The turning point came late one afternoon. A young calf, spooked by a rattlesnake, had bolted and tangled itself in a length of discarded wire near the creek bed. By the time Gabe found it, the animal was in a blind panic, thrashing wildly, the wire cutting deeper into its leg with every movement. Its bawling was frantic and terrified. Gabe approached cautiously, knowing that a panicked animal was a dangerous one. Before he could get close, Lydia was there. She had come running from the cabin, drawn by the calf's cries. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at Gabe for instruction. She moved slowly, her hands held out, palms open. She began to speak to the calf, her voice low and soft, a continuous, melodic stream of soothing nonsense. "Easy now. Easy, little one. It's all right. You're all right." The calf's frantic movements began to slow, its wild eyes fixed on her. She got closer, never breaking the stream of her soft murmurings. She reached out a hand and laid it on the animal's trembling neck, stroking it gently. The calf flinched, but didn't pull away. It let out a low, shuddering moan and leaned into her touch, while she kept it calm, whispering to it. Gabe was able to move in quickly and snip the wire, freeing the leg. He stood back and watched as Lydia continued to stroke the calf, her touch gentle and sure, until its trembling subsided completely. In that moment, Gabe saw past the victim he had rescued from the tent in Dry Laurel. He saw a woman of immense, quiet strength, a woman with a core of compassion that not even the cruelty of men like Silas Mott had been able to extinguish. He saw Lydia Vale, not as a bill of sale, but as a force of nature in her own right. That evening, they sat on the porch steps as usual, drinking coffee as the day cooled around them. But the silence was different, fuller. "You have a way with animals," Gabe said, breaking it. Lydia looked down at her hands, still holding the warm tin mug. "My father taught me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said you can't lie to an animal. They see what's inside you." They fell silent again, but now they talked. They talked about simple, essential things. They talked about water, how it shapes the land and gives life. They talked about the relief of shade on a hot day. They talked about the way the wind sounds just before a storm. They were talking about survival, but they were also talking about hope and peace, and other things that neither of them yet had a name for. Night closed in, bringing with it a darkness that was absolute. Save for the brilliant spray of stars overhead, the wind picked up, rustling through the tall prairie grass with a sound like rushing water, or distant, running horses. The sound startled Lydia, making her sit up straight, her body tense. A flicker of the old fear returned to her eyes. Gabe noticed her reaction. He said nothing, but he rose, went inside the cabin, and returned a moment later with his Spencer rifle. He didn't brandish it. He simply leaned it against the cabin wall, right next to the door, where it was within easy reach. The gesture was both a comfort and a grim acknowledgement of the world that lay beyond the small circle of their lamplight. Lydia watched him, her throat tight. "They'll come back for me," she stated, the words a flat certainty, not a question. Gabe looked out into the immense, whispering darkness, his profile silhouetted against the night. He didn't offer false platitudes or easy reassurances. He offered her the truth and a promise. Then we'll be standing tall when they do. The decision to act was a cold, hard thing that settled in Gabe's mind. Waiting on the ranch was a form of slow surrender, and surrender was not in his nature. With Lydia's tacit agreement, a silent, determined nod that spoke volumes more than words, he rode back into the oppressive heat of dry laurel. This time, he wasn't there for supplies. He was there to start unraveling the rot. His first stop was the modest timber-framed church. Reverend Arlen was a spare, wiry man with kind eyes that had seen too much hardship to hold any judgment. He listened intently as Gabe explained the situation, his gaze resting on the bill of sale Gabe placed on his desk. The paper seemed to defile the sanctity of the room. "This is an abomination, Gabe," Arlen said, his voice a low rumble of indignation. "A legal fiction to sanctify a moral crime. To nullify it, you'll need the county clerk to file a notarized manumission. It needs to be officially recorded." The courthouse was a stuffy two-room building that smelled of dry paper and forgotten justice. The clerk, a balding man with ink-stained cuffs named Peterson, peered at Gabe over his spectacles. He took the document, read it, and a flicker of something unease, perhaps, or recognition passed through his eyes. "This is an indenture agreement from Pinion County," he said, his tone deliberately flat. "Any nullification would have to be filed there. We have no jurisdiction." "It's a fraudulent document," Gabe stated, keeping his voice even. "The woman was taken by force. I'm here to file a sworn affidavit to that effect, to begin the process." Peterson pushed the paper back across the counter. "I'm afraid the justice of the peace is out of town for the circuit court, and I can't accept an affidavit without him. You'll have to come back next week." The man's evasion was as smooth and polished as a river stone. He refused to meet Gabe's eye, his focus suddenly consumed by a stack of unimportant ledgers. Gabe knew a brick wall when he saw one. He had the law on his side, but the law's servants were hiding from him. Frustrated, Gabe left the courthouse and made his way to the Old Hickory Saloon. It was the town's central nerve, a place where whispers traveled faster than the telegraph. He took a table in a dark corner, ordered a beer he had no intention of finishing, and listened. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and stale beer, but beneath the loud boasts and laughter, he caught fragments of the conversations around him. The talk was of cattle prices, the lack of rain, and, eventually, of Silas Mott and his bramble riders. And with Mott's name came another Deputy Ephraim Pike. Pike was seen riding out towards Night Creek again. A grizzled prospector mumbled to his companion. "Funny how he's always patrolling the one road Mott's wagons use." "Ain't so funny when you figure Pike's pockets are lined with Mott's silver," the other man grunted back. "He provides the color of law. Mott provides the cash, a neat arrangement." Gabe stored the name away. Ephraim Pike. The law wasn't just blind in Dry Laurel. It was bought and paid for. He had asked Lydia to stay in the wagon, parked in the relative quiet of the livery stable. When he returned, he found her sitting bolt upright, her face pale. She was staring at a teamster watering his horses at a trough. The man was burly, with a greasy beard, but it was his hand that held Lydia's attention. Curled around the bucket handle was a thick, ugly scar in the shape of a fish hook. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was one of them, the one who pulled me from the granary back home." The memory flashed in her eyes, stark and terrifying. Gabe felt a surge of cold fury. He wanted to walk over there and break the man in two, but he knew that would solve nothing and endanger them both. Instead, he put a steadying hand on the wagon's side. "Stay calm. We'll use this." He watched the man, committing his face to memory. The enemy was no longer a faceless rumor. It had a name, and now it had a face. Back at the ranch that night, the weight of the town's corruption settled heavily upon him. He took out the bill of sale again. It felt different now, more sinister. He had been so focused on the text that he had barely noticed the back. There, pressed lightly into the paper, was a small, embossed symbol, a thorny vine wrapped around a broken spur. It was a maker's mark, a brand, a secret sign used to track his property, working by the faint light of a lantern. Gabe carefully copied the symbol onto a piece of scrap leather, his pencil tracing the sharp, cruel lines. This was the key, the mark of the syndicate. The next morning, they found it. A small, tightly wrapped package lay on the porch steps, tied with plain twine. There was no name, no indication of who had left it. Gabe opened it cautiously. Inside was a hand-drawn map of a place called Cedar Spire Canyon, a maze of red rock and shadow a day's ride south. A single spot on the map was marked with a small, black X. Beside it, 2 words were scrawled, "Gold for goods." It was either a trap or a lifeline from an unknown friend. Gabe had a feeling he had to find out which. The bottom of the map held a single instruction: ask for the school teacher at the mission. 2 days later, Gabe rode into the tiny settlement of San Cristobal Mission. The schoolhouse was a small adobe building, and the teacher was a woman named Constance Rook. She was dressed in the severe, practical clothing of a frontier educator, but her eyes were anything but demure. They were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. She listened to Gabe's story without interruption, her expression revealing neither surprise nor doubt. When he was finished, she simply held out her hand for the bill of sale. "I've been tracking this particular brand of misery for 2 years, she said, her voice crisp and devoid of sentiment. "Ever since I was hired by a family in St. Louis, whose son disappeared on the Continental Line." She wasn't just a school teacher. She was a private detective, one of the few women in the Pinkerton agency's employ, working deep undercover. She ran a finger over the signature at the bottom of the page. "This signature is one of Silas Mott's forgeries, but the embossing, the thorny vine, that's the mark of his entire network. It's on every contract, every ledger. It's how they keep their inventory." She looked at Gabe, her gaze direct. "This paper is evidence, but it's not enough. To break a ring like this, to get past men like Deputy Pike who provide the legal shield, you need more than a document. You need living proof. You need a witness willing to stand up in court and point a finger." Her meaning was clear. The key to everything was Lydia. The ride back to the ranch was long and quiet, the weight of Rook's words settling on Gabe. That night, sitting on the porch, he finally unlocked the part of himself he had kept hidden. He told Lydia about the iron chest. "I was a ranger," he said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the distant, dark line of the hills. "Before I bought this place, we were tracking a band of Kiowa raiders who'd been hitting isolated homesteads. We got a report about a family, the Millers, out on the Cimarron." He paused, the memory still raw. "We rode hard for 2 days, but we were a night too late. When we got there was just silence and smoke." He didn't need to describe what he'd found. The horror was evident in the taut line of his jaw, in the bleakness of his eyes. I quit the Rangers the next week. I couldn't get the image of the little girl's doll lying in the dirt out of my head. I felt like the badge was a brand, marking my failure. He finally looked at her. When I saw you in that tent, it felt like I was being given a second chance, a chance to not be too late. Lydia listened without a word, her own past a silent echo to his. His pain did not diminish hers, but it illuminated it, gave it context in a shared world of loss and survival. She saw the wound he carried, a deep, ragged thing that he had tried to lock away in an iron chest. It was a wound that mirrored her own. In that moment of shared darkness, something shifted between them. The roles of rescuer and victim dissolved, leaving only two people marked by the harshness of the land, two jagged edges that seemed, impossibly, to fit together. The next day, Constance Rook rode out to the ranch, looking every bit the part of a school teacher on a botanical excursion. The three of them sat around the kitchen table, the damning bill of sale and the mysterious map laid out between them. "Silas Mott is arrogant," Rook said, her finger tapping the map. "He believes his system is untouchable because of Pike's protection. We can use that arrogance against him." The plan she'd laid out was simple, audacious, and incredibly dangerous. They would leak a rumor. They would let it be known that the rancher from Painted Fox River was having second thoughts, that the woman he'd bought was more trouble than she was worth, and that he was looking to offload his contract at a discount. "You'll pretend to sell her back," Rook explained, her eyes on Lydia, assessing her resolve. "It's a trap to draw Silas Mott out into the open, to get him and his money in the same place as Lydia, with witnesses. If he takes the bait, we can catch him in the act, outside the protection of Pike's jurisdiction." She turned to Gabe. "I have 2 trusted men I can position at the Black Kettle train station. It's isolated enough. Once the transaction is made, we'll have him." Gabe looked at Lydia. It was her life they were putting on the line. He wouldn't make the choice for her. Lydia met his gaze, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw not fear, but a cold, hard fire. She had spent weeks as a piece of property, a name on a bill of sale. This was her chance to become the hand that closed the trap. "I'll be the bait," she said, her voice clear and steady. The rumor was a greasy seed planted in fertile ground. Gabe let it slip to the liveryman, a known gossip, that he was riding south to meet a circuit judge, and that the woman, Lydia, was being sent back to Pinion County under escort. He made sure to mention the time just after sundown, 2 days hence, and the route through Juniper Pass. Within an hour, the seed had sprouted in the old Hickory Saloon. It grew into a thick vine of speculation and whispers, curling around beer mugs and poker hands. Deputy Ephraim Pike, leaning against the bar with a proprietary air, made a show of ignoring the talk, but his eyes, small and watchful in his fleshy face, missed nothing. He nursed his whiskey, and when the liveryman repeated the story for the 3rd time, Pike allowed a small, satisfied smile to touch his lips before wiping it away. The bait was taken. 2 nights later, the sky tore open. A storm, born in the distant mountains, rolled across the plains, swallowing the stars. Rain fell in cold, hard sheets, and thunder cannonaded across the heavens. The sound so immense it seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. It was the perfect cover. Dressed in an old oilskin poncho of Gabe's, the hood pulled low, Lydia looked small and frail, but beneath the cloak, her resolve was a core of steel. They rode side by side, their horses picking their way carefully through the narrow, rock-strewn cut of Juniper Pass. The world was a maelstrom of sound and fury, the wind howling a mournful chorus, the rain lashing their faces. Every flash of lightning bleached the landscape for a split second, revealing a twisted, skeletal world of jagged rocks and stunted trees, before plunging them back into absolute darkness. They were halfway through the pass when Gabe saw it, high on the ridge to their left. A lantern blinked, once, twice, then a 3rd time, a signal. His hand instinctively went to the stock of the Spencer rifle in his saddle scabbard. "Get ready!" he yelled over the roar of the storm. The ambush came not with a warning shot, but with a sudden, violent explosion of gunfire. Muzzle flashes erupted from the shadows ahead, spitting orange fire into the deluge. The sharp crack of rifles was almost lost in the continuous roll of thunder. A bullet whined past Gabe's ear. Another struck a rock near Lydia's horse, sending up a shower of sparks and stone chips. Her horse reared, screaming in terror. "Lydia, down!" Gabe roared. He spurred his own mount forward, grabbing her reins and practically dragging her horse with his. He steered them off the path, forcing them into the meager shelter of a massive granite boulder. He half threw, half lifted her from the saddle, pushing her down behind the rock. "Stay down." He crouched beside her, the Spencer now in his hands. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, running in rivulets down his face. Another volley of shots slammed into their cover, the lead slugs smacking against the stone with vicious finality. Gabe returned fire, aiming not at the flashes but just beside them, forcing the ambushers to keep their heads down. From further down the pass, a sharp, piercing whistle cut through the storm. 3 short blasts. It was Rook's signal. Her men were in position. A moment later, more gunfire erupted, this time from the ambusher's flank. Rook had sprung her counter-trap. The firefight became a chaotic, 3-way battle fought in flashes of lightning. Men yelled, horses screamed, and the storm raged over all of it, an indifferent god of chaos. Suddenly, a new rider appeared, charging up the pass. "Hold your fire!" a voice bellowed. "This is the law, Deputy Pike. Cease firing." Pike rode into the fray, his badge gleaming wetly in the lightning. He fired his pistol into the air, a gesture of authority. For a confusing moment, the shooting subsided. Gabe watched him, his gut tight with suspicion. Pike wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't part of the plan. "It's an illegal ambush," Pike shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. "I'm taking the woman into protective custody." Under the guise of restoring order, he moved towards Gabe and Lydia's position. The men Rook had brought, seeing a lawman, hesitated. That hesitation was all Pike needed. He wasn't there to stop the fight. He was there to secure the prize. 2 of the original ambushers, now understanding their role, moved with him. Before Gabe could react, Pike had reached their boulder. He grabbed Lydia's arm, his grip like a vice. "You're coming with me, girl, for your own safety." Gabe stood up, rifle leveled. "Let her go, Pike!" Pike just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He shoved Lydia towards one of his men. "Don't be a fool. Harrow, you're outmatched." To prove his point, he raised his Colt and fired a single, deliberate shot into the darkness, not at Gabe, but towards the position where Rook's men were hiding. It wasn't a warning shot. It was a shot to kill, to eliminate a witness and erase any confusion about whose side he was on. He was cleaning house. In the chaos, as Pike's man dragged her away, Lydia acted. Her mind was a point of cold clarity in the storm. Her fingers fumbled at the front of her dress, beneath the heavy poncho. She found the small, bone button she had sewn on herself just days before, using a unique, cross-hatched pattern Gabe had taught her for mending canvas. With a deft twist, she tore it free. As the man shoved her onto his horse, she let the button fall, a tiny piece of herself left behind on a clump of sagebrush. A silent message in the maelstrom, watching them drag her away. A primal rage surged through Gabe. He couldn't fight them all head-on. He needed a weapon bigger than his rifle. His eyes scanned the terrain in a lightning flash, and he saw it on the high slope above the pass. A small herd of longhorn cattle huddled miserably against the storm. An idea, desperate and deadly, took root. He scrambled back to his horse. "Rook!" he bellowed into the wind. "The cattle on the slope!" He didn't know if she heard or understood, but he had no other choice. He swung into the saddle and dug his heels in, not pursuing Pike, but charging up the steep, muddy embankment. His horse fought for purchase, its powerful legs churning. He reached the terrified herd and pulled his pistol. He fired 2 shots into the air right behind them. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The cattle, already on edge from the storm, exploded into a stampede. It was not a run, it was an avalanche of muscle, horn, and hoof. The ground trembled. A wave of terrified, charging animals, 1,000 pounds each, plunged down the muddy slope directly into the path of Pike's retreating posse. The sound was a deafening, terrifying roar. A flood of living battering rams. Pike and his men heard it coming. They turned, their faces aghast in the lightning. There was no time to escape. The stampede hit the narrow pass like a physical blow. A brown, chaotic river of panic. Horses screamed and bucked. Men were unseated, swallowed by the tide. The path was completely, utterly blocked. In the confusion, Silas Mott himself appeared from the rocks. He had been directing the ambush from a safe distance. He saw his prize, Lydia on a panicked, riderless horse. He spurred his own mount forward, grabbing her reins, his face a mask of grim determination. He wasn't going to lose her. He turned his horse and charged not back the way he came, but forward, towards the far end of the pass where a rickety wooden bridge crossed a deep, rain-swollen gorge. Gabe, seeing this, urged his horse through the last of the stampeding cattle. His focus narrowed to the 2 figures fleeing in the darkness. He caught up to them at the entrance to the bridge. Rain sluiced down, making the wooden planks treacherous and slick. "Mott!" Gabe yelled. Silas turned, a snarl on his face. He drew his pistol, but the driving rain had soaked his powder. The gun clicked uselessly. With a curse, he threw it aside and drew a long, wicked-looking knife. He dismounted, pulling Lydia with him. "You want her. Harrow, come and get her." Gabe swung down from his own horse. The 2 men faced each other on the narrow, swaying bridge, the gorge roaring beneath them. They circled each other, 2 predators in the heart of the storm. Gabe lunged, grabbing for Lydia. Silas shoved her aside and met Gabe's charge. They crashed together, a tangle of desperate, straining muscle. Gabe's rancher's strength was pitted against Mott's wiry, street fighter's malice. They slipped and slid on the wet planks, their fists landing with dull, wet thuds. Beneath them, the bridge groaned in protest, a main support beam weakened by years of rot and now burdened by the flash flood, began to splinter, with a sharp crack like a rifle shot. A section of the bridge gave way. The planks beneath Gabe and Silas collapsed. Both men fell. Gabe managed to twist, his fingers catching the splintered edge of a remaining beam. He hung there, his boots dangling over the raging torrent below. Silas was not so lucky. He fell further, but his fall was broken by a tangle of roots growing from the gorge wall just a few feet down. He clung there, momentarily stunned. Lydia, who had scrambled back to her feet, saw Gabe dangling, his grip slipping on the wet wood. The rope. Gabe's lesson. A knot you can trust your life to. She ran to his horse, her hands working frantically to uncoil the lariat from his saddle. Her fingers were numb with cold, but her mind was sharp. She tied a loop, a perfect bowline, just as he had taught her. "Gabe!" she screamed. She swung the rope, once, twice, letting the weight of the coil carry it. She threw it with all her strength. The loop sailed through the rain-soaked air and landed perfectly, right over his head and shoulders. "Hold on!" He managed to get his arms through it. "Pull!" he yelled. She dug her heels into the mud and pulled, her muscles screaming in protest. She was not strong enough to lift him, but she could give him the anchor he needed. He found a foothold on the gorge wall and, using the rope for leverage, began to climb, hand over hand, until he could crawl back onto the stable part of the bridge. He lay there for a moment, gasping, the rain washing over him. He looked down. Silas Mott was already recovering, with surprising agility. He used the roots to scramble down the rest of the way to the narrow, sandy bank at the bottom of the gorge. He gave Gabe one last look of pure hatred, then melted into the darkness and the sheeting rain. Gone. A few minutes later, Constance Rook appeared out of the gloom. She was soaked and muddy, but her face was set and determined. 2 of Pike's men were her prisoners, their hands bound. Pike himself was nowhere to be seen. "Mott got away," Gabe said, getting to his feet. "For now." Rook replied. She turned her attention to one of the captured men, a scrawny outlaw with terrified eyes. Where was he taking her talk now? "And I might mention your cooperation to the judge." The man broke instantly. "The train," he stammered, teeth chattering from cold and fear. "He was gonna move the whole shipment, all the contracts. On the 8 o'clock freight from Black Kettle Station tomorrow morning, he's got a private car waiting." Gabe looked at Lydia. Her face was streaked with mud, her hair plastered to her skin, but her eyes burned with a fire he had never seen before. She had faced down the storm, the ambush, and the man who had bought and sold her. She had saved his life. The victim was gone. "No more running," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the force of an iron bell. "No more hiding. He wants his property. Let him come and claim it." She looked from Gabe to Rook, her decision absolute. "I'll be the bait. Let's finish this at the station." The fury of the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and dripping. The thunder had retreated to a low grumble on the far horizon, and the rain had softened to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the tin roof of the abandoned hay barn they had found. It was a small, 3-sided structure, offering a refuge from the wind and the worst of the downpour. Inside, the air was thick with the sweet, dusty scent of old hay and the damp, loamy smell of the earth. A single lantern, its wick turned low, cast a small circle of warm, flickering light, pushing back against a profound and pressing darkness. They were both shivering, a deep, bone-aching cold that came not just from the wet, but from the chilling proximity of death they had just escaped in the pass. Adrenaline, a fire in the blood, had burned out, leaving them with its icy ash. Gabe took off his heavy, soaked coat and draped it over Lydia's shoulders. The gesture was automatic, protective, but she was trembling so violently, the thick wool seemed to offer little comfort. He built a small, careful fire just inside the shelter's drip line. Using dry tinder, he carried in a waterproof pouch. The flames caught, spitting and hissing as stray raindrops found them, but they grew steadily, adding their own soft, crackling voice to the drumming of the rain. They sat close to the fire, the lantern between them. The flickering light played across their faces, carving hollows and planes from the shadows. Their breath plumed in the cool air, twin ghosts mingling between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The shared ordeal was too large, too raw for words. They had faced down a conspiracy, a stampede, and the raw, murderous hatred of Silas Mott on a collapsing bridge. They had survived, but the echo of that violence still vibrated in the air around them. Gabe watched her. He saw the way she stared into the flames, her eyes wide, reflecting the tiny, dancing points of light. He saw the tremor that still ran through her hands as she held them out to the warmth. He had seen her as a victim, then as a survivor, and tonight, on that bridge, as a savior. The woman who sat before him now was a stranger, and yet he felt he knew her more profoundly than anyone he had ever known. The bill of sale in his pocket felt like a blasphemy, a contemptible lie. No piece of paper could ever define the fierce, resilient spirit of the woman who had thrown him a lifeline over the roaring gorge. It was Lydia who finally broke the silence. Her voice was barely a whisper, so quiet it seemed to be a part of the rustling hay and the falling rain. "I thought I was dead," she said, her gaze still fixed on the fire. "When he grabbed me, when the shooting started, I felt that old coldness, the feeling of being an object, a thing to be fought over and claimed, not a person, just cargo. Gabe had no words of comfort to offer that wouldn't sound hollow and cheap. He simply nodded, his own throat tight with the memory of his helplessness as Pike had dragged her away. She turned her head then, and her eyes, luminous in the lantern light, met his. The fear was gone. In its place was something new, something clear and unbroken. But then you went up that hill, and I saw the cattle, and on the bridge, I wasn't cargo anymore. I was me. I was the one holding the rope. She took a shaky breath. You bought my life, Gabe, and tonight I saved yours. We're even. There was never a debt, Lydia, he said, his voice rough. Not on your side. I know, she whispered. A small, sad smile touched her lips. I think I'm just beginning to understand that. She fell silent again, but her gaze held his. The space between them, once filled with unspoken fear and obligation, was now charged with a different kind of tension. It was the quiet, powerful gravity of two people who had seen the truth of each other in a moment of utter extremity. She shivered again, a violent, rattling tremor. I'm so cold, she said, but her eyes told him she was speaking of a cold that the fire could not touch. It was the cold of loneliness, of being treated as less than human for so long that you forget the feeling of your own warmth. Slowly, she reached out, and her cool, trembling fingers brushed against the back of his hand. The contact was electric, a spark in the quiet dark. Gabe, she whispered, her voice fragile but resolute. Let me feel alive, please, not because of a debt or gratitude or anything you've done for me, but because I am choosing it. I need to feel like a person again. I need to make a choice that is entirely my own. The raw, desperate honesty of her plea struck him with more force than any physical blow. He saw the immensity of what she was offering, and what she was asking for. She was not offering her body to repay him. She was reclaiming it for herself, and inviting him to be a part of that reclamation. For a moment, he was paralyzed. The instinct to protect her, to keep her safe and untouched, warred with a profound understanding of what she was truly saying. To refuse her now would be to deny her the very agency he had fought to give back to her. It would be another man telling her what was best for her, another man making a choice on her behalf. His eyes, which had been bright with a fierce, protective fire, softened. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a ward or a responsibility, but as the woman she was strong, brave, and wounded, a woman who was choosing, in this small, sheltered space, to heal. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. His touch was warm and steady, an anchor. Lydia, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. I don't take anything that isn't freely given. That was all he needed to say. It was the absolution she needed, the final, verbal tearing of that despicable contract. It was his acknowledgement of her choice, of her freedom, of herself. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. But it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release. She leaned forward, and he met her halfway. They rested their foreheads together, their eyes closed. They just breathed, sharing the same small pocket of air, their intertwined hands resting between them. The world outside, with its thunder and its violence, its Silas Motts and its Ephraim Pikes, ceased to exist. There was only the sound of the rain on the roof, the crackle of the fire, and the steady, reassuring beat of two hearts that had, until this moment, beaten alone. He lifted his free hand and gently cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking the line of her cheek. Her skin was cool, but beneath it, he could feel the warmth of her life, the pulse of her blood. She leaned into his touch, a soft, sighing breath escaping her lips. When he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that bordered on reverence. It was a slow, gentle exploration, a question and an answer all at once. There was no desperation in it, no hunger, only a profound and quiet sense of discovery. It tasted of rain and wood smoke, and it was filled with the silent, unspoken understanding of everything they had endured. The kiss deepened, and she brought her other hand up to his chest, her fingers curling into his damp shirt, holding on, in the soft, forgiving light of the lantern. Surrounded by the scent of dry hay and the sound of the storm finally spending its fury, they came together. It was a joining not of bodies, but of souls that had been lost and were now, finally, finding their way home. Their hands, so different in size and texture, his calloused and strong, hers slender but sure, spoke a language of their own, of comfort, of solace, of a shared strength. The firelight danced on the rough wooden walls as the lantern flame flickered and died, and the night, with its deep, sheltering darkness, closed in around them, keeping their secrets safe. Sometime later, in the pre-dawn stillness, Lydia stirred. The fire was a bed of glowing embers, and the rain had stopped. She was nestled against Gabe, his arms securely around her, his coat and a spare horse blanket covering them both. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she had slept without nightmares. She felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost shocking. She was not property. She was not afraid. She was home. She gently extricated herself and moved to the entrance of the barn. The air was cool and clean, washed by the storm. A faint, gray light was beginning to silhouette the eastern horizon. She saw Gabe's poncho, which she had dropped earlier. She picked it up and returned to his side. He was awake, watching her. She didn't say a word, but simply draped the heavy oilskin over his sleeping form, an act of quiet care. He caught her hand and brought it to his lips. A smile, easy and genuine, touched her lips. It was a smile of pure relief, of a weight finally lifted. "We need a plan," he said softly. "Signals," she replied immediately. "So, we know what the other is doing without speaking." They spent the next hour working it out, their voices low and purposeful. A hand to the hat meant Silas was spotted. A closed fist over the heart meant danger. Fall back. 2 fingers pointing to the eyes meant watch Pike. They were no longer a rancher and a refugee. They were partners, strategists planning a battle. When they emerged from the barn, Constance Rook was waiting for them, a tin mug of coffee in her hands. She had made her own camp 100 yards away, giving them their privacy. She took in their appearance, their shared exhaustion, but also the new, quiet strength that seemed to emanate from them. She saw the way Gabe stood closer to Lydia, the way Lydia's gaze met his with an unwavering trust. Rook offered no comment on what might have passed between them in the night. She simply nodded, a knowing, approving look in her sharp eyes. "The men are in position at Black Kettle," she said. "The station master is with us." She took a sip of her coffee, her gaze moving from Gabe to Lydia. "Remember the plan. Keep your heads cool," she advised, then added softly, "and your hearts warm." As if on cue, the sun broke over the horizon, a brilliant flood of gold that washed over the juniper brakes, making the wet sagebrush glitter like it was studded with diamonds. In the far distance, a mournful sound echoed through the clean morning air, the whistle of the 8 o'clock freight train. It was a lonely, chilling sound, like a saw blade cutting through the silence, a reminder that their time was running out. Back at the ranch, as they prepared to ride out, Gabe walked to the iron chest at the foot of his bed. He unlocked it, took out the bill of sale, and placed it inside. He paused, his hand hovering over the tarnished ranger's badge, then closed the lid and turned the key. The paper would wait. Its destruction would be an act of public justice, not private vengeance. Lydia, meanwhile, was getting ready. She strapped a sturdy leather belt around her waist. From a small pouch, she took out a single, smooth, gray stone, a stone she had carried from her home. She had tied it to a leather thong, and now she fastened it securely around her wrist. It was a small, personal talisman, a piece of her past that she was now carrying into her future. It was her own mark, a sign that belonged to no one but herself. As she tightened the knot, she met Gabe's eyes in the small mirror. She was no longer running. She was ready. She was the master of her own life. The Black Kettle train station was little more than a sun-bleached platform, a water tower, and a small, dusty office squatting beside a single set of iron rails that vanished into the immense, shimmering emptiness of the plains. The air was still, heavy with the scent of creosote and hot metal. A sense of nervous anticipation hung over the scene, a quiet tension that made the lazy buzzing of a fly sound unnaturally loud. The illusion of order arrived first, cloaked in the authority of the law. Deputy Ephraim Pike rode in at the head of a small posse of 4 men. They were not his usual thuggish deputies, but rather hired hands dressed to look official, their belts heavy with pistols, their face set in expressions of solemn duty. Pike called them his humane transit escort. He dismounted, his bulk casting a thick shadow on the platform. He was creating a spectacle of legality, a public performance designed to sanitize an act of human trafficking. He was here to officially oversee the transfer of an indentured servant, ensuring her well-being, all under the protective gaze of his star-shaped badge. From the station office, Constance Rook watched him, her face impassive, in her pocket. She felt the crisp fold of the arrest warrant signed by Judge Cormack from the county seat. It was a powerful document, but it was conditional. It named Silas Mott, but to ensnare Pike, she needed an undeniable link, a public and irrefutable act that tied his badge to Mott's crimes. Today, on this platform, Pike would have to physically connect himself to the transaction. She was a hunter, and she was waiting for her quarry to step into the snare. The 8 o'clock freight train was late, its smoke a smudge on the horizon, giving the tension more time to ripen. Then, a buckboard wagon rattled up, driven by Silas Mott himself. He was not a man who hid in shadows when a point of power was to be made. He sat tall, a canvas sack of coins resting on the seat beside him. A pale, nervous man in a city suit sat next to him, his accountant, clutching a thick, leather-bound ledger to his chest like a holy book. This was the signal. Lydia stepped out from behind the water tower. She walked alone, her steps measured and deliberate. She had dressed in the same worn calico she had been sold in, a stark reminder of her status as property. Her head was bowed, her shoulders slumped in a perfect imitation of defeated submission. She appeared broken, a woman being led to the next chapter of her captivity. But beneath the facade, her heart was a cold, steady drum. Every sense was heightened. She could feel the grit of the platform through the thin soles of her shoes, the heat radiating from the iron rails, the collective gaze of every man present. She was the bait, and she could feel the jaws of the trap waiting to spring around her. She walked towards Silas, avoiding his triumphant, possessive gaze. He hopped down from the wagon, the bag of gold clinking heavily in his hand. "Here we are, then," Silas said, his voice loud enough for Pike's men to hear. "A simple business matter. All above board. Deputy." Pike nodded, producing a clipboard with a bill of transfer. "Just sign here, Mr. Smith," he said, handing Silas a pen. The use of the alias was a key part of the trap. As Silas leaned on the wagon to sign the false name to the false document, another, quieter transaction was taking place, inside the station office. Gabe stood beside the station master, a wiry old man named Elias, whose hatred for Silas Mott was a quiet, simmering fire. In front of Elias was his telegraph key. As Silas began to sign, Elias's fingers started to fly across the brass key, the rhythmic clicking a secret language translating the scene outside into a cascade of electrical pulses. Click, clack, click, Black Kettle Station. Click, click, 8:14 a.m. Elias's eyes were on the scene, and his fingers reported what he saw. Silas Mott, using alias Jedediah Smith, finalizing purchase. Click, clack. Bill of transfer for Lydia Vale. He described the sack of gold, the presence of Deputy Pike, the names of Pike's men. Each piece of information was being sent in real time. Down the iron wire that ran alongside the tracks, it was being recorded, word for word, by a clerk in the Cormac County Courthouse, 100 miles away. Gabe was not just witnessing the crime. He was creating an official, unimpeachable, time-stamped record of it, burning it into the legal archives with lightning. Outside, Silas finished signing with a flourish. He tossed the pen down and hefted the bag of coins. There, payment in full. He looked at Lydia with a cruel smile. My property again. Pike took the clipboard. Everything is in order, he announced officiously. He gestured to his men. Escort the woman to the rear carriage. This was the critical moment. The physical act Rook was waiting for. Pike was about to take possession of Lydia on Mott's behalf. Two of the escort started towards Lydia. Gabe had seen enough. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to a stable hand he'd paid earlier. The man, who had been leading a train of 6 pack mules laden with heavy sacks of salt, suddenly slapped the lead mule hard on the rump. The animal brayed in protest and lunged forward. Directly towards the platform, the other mules followed. A chaotic, braying, clattering line of panic. Sacks of salt tore open, spilling white crystals across the platform. Pike's men, caught completely by surprise, scattered to avoid the sudden stampede of stubborn, kicking animals. The carefully constructed scene of legal order shattered into pandemonium. Men shouted, mules brayed, and the air filled with dust and confusion. It was the perfect diversion. In the midst of the chaos, all eyes were on the mules. No one was watching the pale accountant who still stood by the wagon, clutching his ledger. No one but Constance Rook. She moved with a fluid, lethal grace. She was no longer a schoolteacher. She was an agent of justice. In 3 swift strides, she was beside the accountant. Pinkerton Agency, she said, her voice low and cold as steel. She flashed a small, silver badge. The accountant's face went white with terror. Before he could react, she had his arm twisted behind his back and a set of iron manacles snapped shut on his wrist. You are under arrest for conspiracy to engage in human trafficking. She took the ledger from his unresisting hand. The trap now had its most important piece of physical evidence. Silas Mott saw it happen. He saw Rook, he saw the badge, and he saw his precious ledger, the book that contained every name, every date, every damning detail of his entire operation in her hands. The color drained from his face. He understood. In an instant, the full scope of the trap. The train, which had been slowly pulling into the station, gave a loud blast of its whistle. It was Silas's signal. Go! He screamed at the engineer, his voice raw with fury. Go now! The train's massive drive wheels began to spin, churning on the tracks, trying to gain purchase. With a great hiss of steam and a groan of metal, the engine began to pull the long line of freight cars forward. Pike, seeing his plan and his payday evaporating, made a desperate lunge for Lydia. He grabbed her arm, intending to throw her onto the moving train, to salvage something from the disaster. But Lydia was ready. She was not the trembling woman she had pretended to be. As Pike grabbed her, she drove her elbow back, hard, into his soft gut. He grunted, his grip loosening for a split second. It was all she needed. She twisted away from him, not running, but moving towards the space between the passenger car they were meant to board and the freight car in front of it. The train was picking up speed, the rhythmic clatter of its wheels accelerating. Silas was already scrambling onto the steps of the passenger car, his face a mask of rage. He pulled his pistol, aiming back at the platform. Lydia reached the coupling. It was a heavy iron pin, thick with grease, holding the 2 cars together. Her hands, which had fumbled with ropes just weeks before, were now sure and strong. She grabbed the handle on the pin, planting her feet on the moving stirrup. With a grunt of exertion born of pure, focused rage, she pulled, The heavy pin resisted. Then, with a loud, grating screech, it came free in her hands. The sound of the uncoupling was brutal, a scream of tortured steel. The freight car, suddenly released from the weight behind it, lurched forward. The passenger car, its momentum broken, immediately began to slow, the gap between the two widening with every turn of the wheels. Lydia held the heavy pin in her hand, a symbol of her freedom, and leaped from the slowing car back onto the platform, stumbling but not falling. She had literally and figuratively severed her connection to Silas Mott. She had set herself free. The chaos on the platform had drawn a crowd. Townspeople, hearing the commotion and the gunshots Silas had fired wildly into the air, came running from the mercantile and the saloon. They arrived to see a scene of utter confusion, panicked mules, spilled salt, a man in handcuffs, and Lydia Vale standing tall in the center of it all, a heavy iron pin in her hand. Into this tableau stepped Reverend Arlen. He had arrived with the others, but he carried a book. He held it up, and his voice, honed by years in the pulpit, rang out with clarity and power. "Let it be known," he called out, and the crowd quieted to listen. "As of last month, the territorial legislature has passed the Freedom Act. It declares, and I quote, any contract, bill of sale, or indenture that treats a human being as chattel or property is hereby declared null, void, and an affront to the laws of God and man." His words landed like stones in a silent pool, creating ripples of understanding and indignation through the crowd. He wasn't just quoting a law. He was giving the townspeople a moral foundation, a righteous framework for the outrage they were feeling. Pike, winded and panicked, saw the tide of public opinion turning against him. He saw the ledger in Rook's hands. He saw Lydia, free and defiant. He made a move to grab the ledger from Rook, to destroy the evidence. "That's illegal evidence," he sputtered. Rook held it out of his reach. "Tell that to Judge Cormac," she said calmly. In the struggle, Pike's sweaty hand brushed against a page of the ledger where the ink was still fresh from a recent entry. A dark, telltale smear of blue ink marked his palm and fingers. It was a brand, a visible stain that connected him, as clearly as a signature, to the criminal enterprise. He looked at his hand, and pure terror dawned in his eyes. He was exposed, ruined. His training, his authority, his life as a lawman. It all dissolved in that moment, replaced by the raw instinct of a cornered animal. He drew his pistol, his hand shaking, and pointed it wildly. His panicked gaze settled on the source of all his trouble, Lydia. "You!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "This is all your fault!" He pulled the trigger. The explosion of the gunshot was deafening in the sudden silence. But before the bullet could find its mark, Gabe moved. He had been making his way through the chaos, and now he launched himself forward, shoving Lydia behind him, putting his own body between her and the gun. The world seemed to slow down. He felt a searing, white-hot line of pain as the bullet tore through the thick fabric of his left sleeve, grazing the flesh of his arm. It was a shallow wound, but it was enough. The crowd gasped. Pike looked at his smoking pistol, at the blood welling on Gabe's arm, and at the wall of angry, accusing faces that now surrounded him. He was no longer a deputy. He was a criminal, an outcast. He turned and ran, shoving people out of his way, a desperate, clumsy flight from the justice that had finally caught up to him. He scrambled off the platform and sprinted down the dusty street, heading for the one place he thought he might still find sanctuary, the town hall. The gunshot echoed off the false fronts of Dry Laurel's main street, and, in its wake, a new sound began, the frantic, clanging toll of the church bell. Reverend Arlen, seeing Pike flee, had sent his young deacon scrambling up the bell tower with a single instruction: ring it until justice is done. The sound was not a call to worship, but an alarm, a frantic, hammering heartbeat for a town whose peace had just been irrevocably shattered. It was a sound of crisis, and it pulled every citizen from their homes and businesses out into the dusty street. The street itself became a battleground. Dust, kicked up by running feet and panicked horses, billowed in thick, choking clouds, turning the harsh sunlight into a hazy, dreamlike glare. It was like the smoke of a battlefield, a fitting backdrop for the desperate flight of a fallen lawman. Pike ran with a clumsy, lumbering gait, his face a mask of sweat and terror. He was no longer a figure of authority. He was a cornered animal, and the town he had once lorded over had become a maze of hostile, accusing eyes. He scrambled up the side of the mercantile, his boots finding purchase on a rain barrel and then a window ledge. With a desperate heave, he pulled himself onto the low, slanted roof of the porch. From this vantage point, he could see the crowd surging below him. He was trapped. He fumbled to reload his pistol, his hands shaking so badly he dropped 2 cartridges into the dust below. Meanwhile, in the alleyway between the saloon and the assayer's office, the other snake was preparing to strike. Silas Mott, having slipped away from the train station in the initial chaos, had circled around. He saw Constance Rook moving purposefully through the crowd, the precious ledger tucked under her arm. She was focused on Pike, coordinating with a few deputized citizens to cut off his escape. She was the brain of the operation, and Silas knew that if he could take her out, the entire case against him might crumble. He flattened himself against the rough brick wall, the long, thin blade of a skinning knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. He was a creature of the shadows, and he waited for the moment she would pass the alley's mouth. Lydia saw him first, while others were mesmerized by the drama of Pike on the roof. Her attention was divided. Her instincts, honed by weeks of living in fear, were screaming at her. She scanned the alleys, the doorways, the dark spaces, and she saw him a flicker of movement, the glint of steel in the shadows. Rook was walking directly into his path, completely unaware. There was no time to shout a warning that would be heard over the din of the bell and the crowd. Lydia's mind worked with lightning speed. Her eyes darted around, searching for a weapon. She saw a pile of loose stones near the blacksmith's shop, used for chalking wagon wheels. She scooped one up. It was the size of a fist, heavy and solid in her hand. She took 2 quick steps to get a clear line of sight. Silas was just beginning to lunge from the alley, the knife held low, aimed for Rook's back. Lydia drew her arm back and threw. The rock flew true, a gray blur against the dusty air. It struck Silas's wrist with a sickening crack. The knife flew from his nerveless fingers, skittering across the boardwalk. He cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain and surprise, clutching his shattered wrist. The attack was broken. Rook spun around, her own pistol drawn in an instant. She saw Silas, his face contorted in agony, and the knife lying on the ground. She didn't hesitate. She holstered her weapon and closed the distance, her movements brutally efficient. She seized Silas's good arm, twisted it behind his back, and forced him to his knees with a sharp application of leverage. "It's over, Mott," she said, her voice a low, cold promise. The mastermind of the Bramble Riders, the phantom who bought and sold human lives, was captured in a dusty alley, brought down not by a bullet, but by a woman with a stone. Above them, the rooftop drama was reaching its climax. Pike was growing more desperate. He grabbed the arm of a merchant who had been trying to reason with him from an upper-story window. "Stay back!" Pike shrieked, pulling the terrified man partway onto the roof, using him as a human shield. "All of you, stay back, or I'll shoot him." Gabe saw this from the street below. He couldn't get a clear shot. The crowd was a panicked, surging mass, and Pike was shielded by an innocent man. He looked around, his gaze falling on the church. The bell was still tolling, its rhythm frantic, and from the belfry, the long, thick bell rope dangled, swaying with each clang. It was a crazy, desperate idea. He pushed his way through the crowd and into the church. He took the stairs to the choir loft, 2 at a time, then climbed the narrow, steep ladder into the belfry. The noise was deafening, a physical assault of vibrating bronze. He grabbed the thick, rough rope just above the deacon's hands. "Let go," he yelled. The young man, wide-eyed, did as he was told. Gabe took a deep breath, got a running start, and launched himself out of the open arch of the belfry. He swung in a wide, terrifying arc, the town spreading out beneath him. For a moment, he was suspended between the sky and the street. He used his legs to guide his momentum, swinging directly towards the roof of the mercantile. He hit the slanted shingles hard, his boots scraping for purchase. He let go of the rope and rolled, the impact jarring his bones. He came to a stop just a few feet from Pike. The merchant, seeing his chance, scrambled back through the window to safety. Pike was left exposed, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He raised his pistol to fire at Gabe, but the old roof, never meant to hold the weight and impact of two fighting men, chose that moment to give way. With a great groan of protesting timber and a sharp crack of snapping lathes, the section of roof beneath them collapsed. They fell in a shower of splintered wood and broken shingles. It was not a long drop. They crashed down onto the wooden balcony of the blacksmith's shop, which ran directly below the mercantile's roofline. They landed in a heap, the air knocked from their lungs. Gabe recovered first, but Pike was quicker. He rolled and came up with the pistol still clutched in his hand. He pressed the hot muzzle against Gabe's throat before Gabe could even get to his feet. The crowd below gasped, a collective intake of breath. "It's over, Harrow," Pike snarled, his breath coming in ragged, spit-flecked gasps. His eyes were wild, the pupils dilated with feral panic. He was a man with nothing left to lose. "There's no judge here, no jury." He pressed the gun harder, the metal biting into Gabe's skin. "Out here, the only law that matters is the law I'm holding in my hand." Down in the street, Lydia watched, her heart frozen in her chest. She saw Gabe, helpless, with a gun to his throat. She knew that brute force would not win this. Pike was beyond reason, but she had a weapon more powerful than any gun. She looked at the thick, leather-bound ledger still clutched in Rook's hand. She walked over to the detective. "Give it to me," she said, her voice steady. Rook looked at her, saw the cold, clear purpose in her eyes, and handed over the book. Lydia then walked to Reverend Arlen, who had come out of the church and was standing at the edge of the crowd. She opened the ledger to the first page, a damning list of names and numbers. "Read it, Reverend," Lydia said, her voice carrying in the sudden, tense silence. "Read it loud enough for everyone to hear." Arlen looked at the page, and his face hardened with a righteous anger. He took the book and held it high. He didn't need to be on his pulpit. The street was his church now, and the townspeople his congregation. "A ledger of accounts for Silas Mott and Associates," he began, his voice booming across the square. "Entry 1, Mary Beth Tanner, age 19, acquired for cancellation of a $30 debt, sold to the Union Pacific work camps for $100. Markings a scar above the left eye." A woman in the crowd let out a sob. "Mary Beth, that was my cousin's girl. They said she ran off to St. Louis." Pike flinched as if struck. The minister's voice was like a hammer, and each word was a nail being driven into his coffin. "Entry 2, Arlen continued, his voice rising. "Samuel Jones, age 22, acquired for a gambling marker, sold to the silver mines in Colorado for $150, markings branded with the thorny spur." He looked up at the crowd. "The same mark on the bill of sale for Miss Vale here." The names went on. A young boy sold for the price of a lame horse, a woman taken in lieu of a seed loan. Each name was a ghost, a stolen life now given voice. Each entry was a testament to the quiet, systematic evil that had been allowed to fester in their territory, protected by the very man who now held a gun to an innocent man's throat. Lydia watched Pike's face. With every name the Reverend read, a piece of his bluster, his authority, his very identity, seemed to crumble. He was being stripped bare in front of the entire town. his crimes laid out for all to see. He was no longer a feared deputy. He was just a grubby, pathetic criminal, exposed by the truth. The crowd, which had been a fearful audience, began to change. Their fear was burning away, replaced by a cold, collective anger. They were no longer just watching. They began to press forward, a silent, shuffling wall of bodies, their faces hard with judgment. They were ranchers, blacksmiths, merchants, and mothers. They were the town, and they were taking it back. Pike saw them coming. He saw the hatred in their eyes. His gun hand trembled, his snarling bravado evaporated, replaced by a raw, animal fear. In that moment of hesitation, the town blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Jedediah, acted. He was standing just below the balcony. With a powerful, upward swing, he slammed the smooth, heavy handle of his forging hammer against Pike's wrist. The sound of bone breaking was sharp and clear. The pistol flew from Pike's numb fingers, clattering harmlessly onto the balcony floor. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and defeat. Gabe didn't waste a second. He kicked the gun away, surged to his feet, and slammed Pike back against the wall. He wrenched the deputy's arms behind his back. He took the manacles from his own belt, the ones Pike had intended for Lydia, and snapped them shut on the fallen lawman's wrists. The click of the cuffs was loud and final. Justice, in the end, had come not from a gun, but from the will of the people and the weight of the truth. Gabe shoved Pike towards the edge of the balcony. Below, the crowd parted. Constance Rook stepped forward, her face grimly satisfied. She looked up at Gabe and gave a single, sharp nod. She then turned to the two men holding Silas Mott. As they dragged Silas through the crowd, he spat on the ground. He looked at Gabe, at Lydia, and at the ledger still in the minister's hand. A twisted, confident sneer spread across his face. "You think you've won?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "That book is just paper. You have no one who will stand up in court. Without a living witness to testify against me, you've still lost." He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You'll see. You've won nothing." The Cormac County Courthouse was not a place of grandeur. It was a hall of reckoning, built of solid, unadorned timber, and it smelled of pine resin, old paper, and the faint, ever-present dust of the plains. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes, lanced down from the high windows, illuminating the grim, determined faces of the jury. They were the men Gabe lived and worked amongst ranchers with hands permanently curled from holding reins, farmers with the soil of their land etched into their knuckles, and the town blacksmith, his forearms a testament to a life spent wrestling with iron and fire. They were not men of nuanced legal theory. They were men of substance, of right and wrong. At the defendant's table sat Silas Mott and a disgraced Ephraim Pike. Pike was a deflated version of his former self, his face pasty and his eyes darting nervously around the room. Mott, by contrast, was a coiled spring of reptilian calm. He was flanked by a sharp, expensive-looking lawyer from back east named Fletcher, a man whose tailored suit was an insult to the rough-hewn honesty of the room. The prosecutor, a weary but dogged man named Davies, began. He held up the bill of sale, presenting it to the jury as if it were a venomous snake. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice devoid of theatrics, "this is a document of evil. It purports to codify the sale of a human being, Miss Lydia Vale, as if she were a side of beef or a barrel of nails. It is a lie, wrapped in the thin paper of a fraudulent legality." When it was his turn, Fletcher rose, his movements smooth and condescending. "A lie, Mr. Davies, or a simple contract that my client, Mr. Mott, entered into in good faith, a contract, I might add, that Miss Vale's own father signed, and which Miss Vale herself did not contest until she met Mr. Harrow." He gestured towards Lydia. "This is not a case of trafficking, gentlemen. This is a case of a voluntary agreement. Plain and simple, an agreement Mr. Harrow saw fit to purchase, and is now, for reasons of his own, attempting to renege on. The lie was so audacious, so perverse, that a low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Fletcher was trying to turn Lydia's ordeal into a simple, sordid business dispute. Gabe was called to the stand. Davies asked him one question. "Mr. Harrow, did you, on the afternoon of August 4th, pay $100 in gold for this document?" Gabe looked not at the lawyer, but at the 12 men in the jury box. "Yes, I did," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I paid $100, not to buy a person, but to stop a crime. I paid to put an end to a grotesque spectacle that shamed every decent man who witnessed it. I would have paid $1,000. My only crime was that I was forced to participate in filth in order to stop it." The words landed with a simple, undeniable force of truth. But Fletcher was not so easily deterred. He cross-examined Gabe, his questions dripping with insinuation, trying to paint him as a man driven by lust or a personal vendetta. The trial seemed to teeter on the edge of becoming a circus of character assassination. Then, Constance Rook was called. She took the stand, her demeanor as crisp and professional as a new banknote. She presented the ledger. "This," she said, her voice cutting through the stuffy air, "is the business record of Silas Mott's criminal syndicate." Fletcher was on his feet. "Objection, that is an unproven assertion." "Allow me to prove it," Rook said calmly. She opened the ledger and asked the clerk to hand her the original bill of sale, using a small magnifying glass. She showed the jury the tiny, embossed mark on the back of Lydia's contract, the thorny vine wrapped around a broken spur. Then, she pointed to the same embossed mark, pressed into the inside cover of the ledger. "The mark of the syndicate," she stated. "A brand, used to track their property. The same brand on the bill of sale, the same brand on the book that details dozens of other such transactions." She wasn't finished. She produced the telegraph transcripts, the official record from the Cormac County Clerk's office. "And here," she said, "we have a real-time account of the attempted transaction at the Black Kettle Station, as witnessed and transmitted by the station master. It details Mr. Mott using an alias, paying for Miss Vale, and Deputy Pike acting as his armed enforcer. The timestamps on this transcript match the events of that morning to the second. The evidence was a chain, and each of Rook's statements was another iron link, locking Mott and Pike together in a conspiracy of cold, hard facts. Reverend Arlen testified next. He spoke with a righteous fire, his voice trembling with a fury that had been long suppressed. He told the court of the night he had followed one of Mott's wagons to a warehouse behind his own church. "I saw them through a crack in the boards," he said, his eyes filled with a pained memory. "Two young women, bound and terrified. Silas Mott was there, and Ephraim Pike stood guard outside, his badge a mockery of every oath he ever swore. I tried to intervene. I went for the town marshal, but by the time we returned, they were gone. I failed them." He looked at the jury, his expression raw. This was no voluntary agreement. This was coercion at the end of a gun, sanctified by a corrupt lawman. Finally, it was Lydia's turn. When her name was called, a hush fell over the courtroom. Silas Mott leaned forward, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Expecting to see a broken, weeping victim, he was disappointed. Lydia walked to the stand with her head held high, her steps even and sure. There were no tears in her eyes. There was only a cold, clear, unshakable resolve. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a reckoning. Davies was gentle. "Miss Vale, can you tell the court how Deputy Pike was involved in your initial sale?" Lydia's voice was quiet, but it filled the silent room. "He wasn't there when I was first taken, but he was there when they legitimized the paperwork. The men who held me were worried about transporting me across county lines. They met with Pike on the road. He had a special stamp, a metal embosser." She looked directly at Pike, who shrank from her gaze. "He called it his public security authorization stamp. He pressed it into the paper. next to the signature, and said, "There, now she's just cargo, fully authorized for transit." He made it official. He turned a kidnapping into a piece of paperwork. The detail was so specific, so chillingly bureaucratic, that it left no room for doubt. This was not a lie. This was a memory, seared into her mind. When Fletcher rose to cross-examine her, intending to tear her story apart, she simply met his gaze with her own clear, unwavering stare. He asked her a series of insinuating questions, trying to trip her up, but she answered each one with a simple, devastating honesty that made his legal tricks seem cheap and pathetic. He had come to the stand to fight a victim. He found himself facing a witness whose spirit he could not break. After a few minutes, he retreated to his table, defeated. It was then that Gabe stood up. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge, "I request permission to present one final piece of evidence." The judge, intrigued, nodded his assent. Gabe walked to the back of the courtroom, where he had placed the heavy, iron-banded chest. He carried it to the front of the room and set it before the witness stand. The entire room watched, transfixed, as he produced a key and unlocked it. He reached inside. The first thing he took out was the tarnished, star-shaped badge of a Texas Ranger. He held it up for the jury to see. "I carried this for 5 years," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I believed it stood for something, for justice, for protecting the innocent." Then, he reached back into the chest and took out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. "This is a letter," he said. "It was written to me by a man named Henry Miller, or rather, by a circuit preacher on his behalf, because Mr. Miller couldn't write. It's a letter of apology for being too slow, for arriving a day after his entire family had been slaughtered." He looked at the jury, his own private hell exposed for all to see. "I kept this badge and this letter to remind myself of what happens when good men are too late." He set the badge and the letter on the clerk's desk. Then he reached into his pocket and produced a piece of paper. It was a copy of Lydia's bill of sale. "This document, this lie, says that one person can own another. It is the root of all this suffering." He struck a match. The flame flared in the dim courtroom. He held it to the corner of the paper. "This is what we do with the lies," he said. As the copy curled into black ash and smoke, he dropped the burning remains into a metal spittoon, where they hissed and died. Then he took the original bill of sale from the clerk's desk. He walked over to Judge Cormac's bench and laid it before him. "And this," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "is what we do with the truth. We hand it to the law to be used as a weapon." The courtroom erupted. People were on their feet, shouting, a cathartic release of pent-up outrage. The blacksmith on the jury was pounding his fist on the railing, a look of grim approval on his face. Judge Cormac slammed his gavel down, the sharp reports barely audible over the din. "Order," he roared. "Order in this court." When the room had quieted, he looked down at Mott and Pike, his face a mask of cold fury. He looked at the ledger, the telegraphs, the badge, the letter, and the bill of sale. "This court," he announced, his voice like dry gravel, "finds that there is more than sufficient evidence to proceed. The charges are not simple contract fraud." He fixed his gaze on the defendants. "The charges are human trafficking, conspiracy, and abuse of public power. This jury will rule on your guilt." A collective sigh of relief and victory went through the crowd. But at the defendant's table, Silas Mott was not looking at the judge. He was looking at Gabe, and he was smiling a thin, cold smile. He leaned over to his lawyer, his voice a low, venomous whisper, but one that carried in the sudden silence. "I won't spend a day in jail," he growled. As he said it, several men in the back of the courtroom, rough-looking men who had trickled in during the trial, exchanged subtle, knowing glances. They began to shift their positions, their hands drifting casually towards the pistols on their hips. They were not there to watch a trial. They were a rescue party, waiting for the signal. The battle in the courtroom was over, but the war for justice was about to explode. The final words of the judge's pronouncement hung in the air, a death sentence to Silas Mott's empire. But before the gavel could fall, before the verdict could be officially recorded, chaos erupted. A sharp, metallic snap echoed from outside the courthouse as the telegraph line. The town's connection to the outside world was cut, almost simultaneously. A cry of fire went up from the street. Black smoke, thick and acrid, began to billow into the sky from the direction of the town's massive grain silo, the pride and economic heart of the entire county. It was a classic two-pronged diversion, one action to isolate them, the other to panic them. Mott's men, positioned throughout the town, had acted on a silent signal. In the ensuing confusion, they burst into the courtroom. Gunshots exploded, shattering the high windows. People screamed and dove for cover. The two bailiffs were overwhelmed in seconds. Silas Mott and Ephraim Pike were yanked from their chairs and hustled towards a side door, their escape route already planned. But they hadn't counted on the jury. The 12 men, who had just been debating the fate of these criminals, were now a small, furious army. The blacksmith, Jedediah, upended the heavy oak jury box, creating a barricade. The ranchers and farmers, men who lived with daily, casual violence, stood their ground. The courtroom became a brawl of flying fists and splintered furniture. It wasn't a calculated battle. It was a raw, visceral rejection of lawlessness. Gabe, however, saw the bigger picture. This brawl was just a holding action. Mott's real plan was to get to the open country. He grabbed Reverend Arlen by the arm. "Get the men," he yelled over the din. "The ones who can ride and shoot, meet me at the livery. We have to cut them off at the Painted Fox River." While the townspeople fought to contain the immediate threat, Gabe slipped out the back. He was not a brawler. He was a tactician. He knew this land. The only fast route out of Cormac County to the south was across the shallow ford of the Painted Fox. If Mott reached it, he would be gone. As men, their faces grim with determination, streamed towards the livery stable, Gabe saw Rook. She was calm amidst the chaos, a reloading cylinder for her pistol held between her teeth. "They'll have a wagon waiting," she said, her voice clipped and precise. "I'll take the high ground, the water tower. I can slow them down." She gave him a sharp nod. "Don't get yourself killed." Harrow. The town militia was a motley but resolute crew. They thundered out of town on a dozen different mounts, a cloud of righteous dust in their wake. Gabe led them, not directly towards the river, but on a wide, looping path. He was heading for the high pasture that overlooked the ford, where the town's collective herd of cattle grazed. He was not just planning to stop Mott, he was planning to build a wall. Back in town, Lydia had seen Silas and Pike being forced into a heavy-duty transport wagon, the kind used for hauling ore. The driver cracked his whip, and the wagon lurched into the smoke-filled street. She refused to be a spectator in the final act of her own story. She ran to the livery, where one horse remained a spirited gray gelding named Brisket that Gabe had been training. She threw a saddle on its back, her hands a blur of practiced motion. She grabbed a coiled lariat from a peg on the wall and swung into the saddle, her face set like stone. She was no longer the woman who had been dragged from a granary. She was the woman who had thrown a rope across a chasm, and she was about to do it again. She galloped through the chaotic streets, Brisket's hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones. The wagon was 100 yards ahead, careening towards the river road. She urged the gray horse faster, the wind tearing at her hair. She was closing the distance. From her perch on top of the water tower, Constance Rook saw the entire tableau laid out below. She saw Gabe's militia racing towards the high pasture. She saw Lead Dia in hot pursuit of the wagon, and she saw the wagon itself, a black, rumbling beetle trying to escape the closing fist of the town. She raised her rifle, sighting down the long barrel. She was a crack shot, but her purpose was not to kill. She breathed out, squeezed the trigger, and a splinter of wood flew from the front axle of the wagon wheel. The wagon swerved violently, nearly tipping before the driver wrestled it back under control. He pushed the horses harder, his face pale with fear. Rook fired again, this time shredding one of the thick leather reins. Her shots were surgical, designed to cripple, not to kill anyone who might be an unwilling participant. Lydia saw her chance in the wagon's momentary instability. She spurred Brisket alongside the thundering vehicle, the noise a deafening roar of wheels and hooves. She stood in her stirrups, swinging the lariat, the loop a perfect, open circle. She wasn't aiming for a man. She was aiming for the wagon's steering mechanism, the heavy wooden tiller bar that connected to the front axle. She cast the rope. The loop sailed true, dropping perfectly over the end of the tiller. She pulled the slack, dallied the rope around her saddle horn, and reined Brisket sharply to the left. The effect was instantaneous. The rope went taut, yanking the tiller with incredible force. The wagon's front wheels jackknifed. The vehicle swerved violently, one wheel lifting high off the ground. The driver was thrown from his seat, and the whole contraption slewed sideways into a ditch with a great, groaning crash of splintering wood. Silas Mott was thrown clear, landing hard in the tall, dry grass of the riverbank. He came up, bruised and enraged, and saw Lydia dismounting from her horse. The primal, possessive fury returned to his eyes. If he couldn't have his freedom, he would have his property. He lunged at her, grabbing her by the arm and dragging her towards the river. He pulled his knife. "Stay back," he screamed at the approaching riders.
"She's my hostage. I'll kill her."
Lydia did not struggle or plead. She stood straight and tall, her chin up, and looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze burning with a contempt that was more powerful than his rage. "No one owns me anymore," she said, her voice clear and ringing. Her defiance stunned him, robbing his threat of its power. It was the moment Gabe arrived. He had led the militia and the cattle to the river's edge just in time. The herd, numbering over 100, formed a massive, living wall of horn and hide, completely blocking the ford, now seeing Silas with a knife to Lydia's throat. Gabe dismounted and walked forward, his hands empty and open.
"Let her go, Mott,"
he said, his voice dangerously calm.
"It's over."
Silas laughed, a ragged, unhinged sound. "It's over when I say it is." He shoved Lydia away and charged at Gabe, the knife held low. The two men met in a brutal, desperate clash. It was not a refined fight. It was a raw, physical struggle for dominance fought in the dust and reeds of the riverbank. Gabe had the strength, but Silas had the wiry, vicious speed of a cornered predator. They grappled, their boots sinking into the soft mud. Gabe landed a solid punch that sent Silas staggering back, but Silas came back at him, swiping wildly with the knife, opening a long, shallow cut on Gabe's forearm. Gabe ignored the pain. He saw an opening and drove his shoulder into Mott's chest, sending them both tumbling to the ground, right next to the wrecked wagon. They rolled, each man fighting for control. Silas, on his back, brought the knife up in a desperate, underhanded thrust, aiming for Gabe's gut. But another hand shot into the fray. She had not run. She had circled around the fight, her mind cold and clear. She grabbed Silas's wrist with both of her hands, her grip like an iron clamp. He was stronger, but her leverage was perfect. She stopped the upward thrust of the knife just inches from Gabe's body. Silas snarled, trying to wrench his hand free, but Lydia held on with a strength born of pure adrenaline and righteous fury. She didn't just stop him. With a powerful, twisting motion, she turned his hand over, forcing the point of his own knife down, until it pierced the wooden floorboards of the wrecked wagon bed. The blade sank an inch into the thick plank. Silas screamed, his hand pinned, the weapon now his prison. Before he could even react, Lydia grabbed the loose, dangling leather reins from the wagon, and with a series of quick, efficient movements, wrapped them tightly around his pinned wrist and the knife handle, lashing him securely to the floor. He was trapped, disarmed by his own weapon and the woman he had sought to own. Across the field, the second escape was also failing. Ephraim Pike, having been thrown from the wagon, tried to use the confusion to his advantage. He kept his head down and tried to melt into the crowd of townspeople who had now arrived on the scene, but he was a large, conspicuous man. Two figures stepped out of the crowd to block his path: the massive blacksmith Jedediah, his hammer held loosely in one hand, and Reverend Arlen, his Bible clutched in the other. One represented the law of man, the other the law of God. "There is no hole for you to crawl into, Ephraim," the Reverend said, his voice filled with a sad finality. Pike's shoulders slumped in utter defeat. Jedediah took the manacles from his belt and cuffed the former deputy without a word. He then handed the prisoner over to Constance Rook, who had made her way down from the tower. The last piece of the conspiracy was secured. A great collective cheer went up from the assembled townspeople. The church bell, which had been ringing frantically, now changed its rhythm. It began to toll, a slow, deep, resonant peal of victory. The citizens of Cormac County formed a wide, silent circle around the wrecked wagon. They watched as Gabe pulled a gasping Silas Mott to his feet. Mott stood there, his hands still bleeding, his eyes filled with a hatred that had burned away everything else. He looked at Gabe, expecting a final, fatal blow. But Gabe did not raise a weapon. He looked at the man who had caused so much pain, at the man who had tried to destroy the woman he loved. He saw not a monster, but a pathetic, grasping creature, now stripped of all his power. He drew back his fist. The punch was not delivered in rage, but with a deliberate, decisive force. It was a full stop at the end of a long and bloody sentence. The blow sent Silas crumpling to his knees in the dirt. Gabe stood over him, breathing heavily, the cut on his arm dripping blood onto the dust. He looked at Lydia, at the crowd, and at the law represented by Constance Rook. "Justice doesn't need any more blood," he said, his voice clear and strong for all to hear. He turned his back on the kneeling Silas Mott and offered his hand to the bailiffs. "He belongs to the court, the justice of the frontier, once awakened, moved with the speed and finality of a prairie fire. There was no lengthy deliberation. The evidence was a mountain, the testimony a river of truth that had washed away every lie. The jury, 12 grim-faced men who had seen the rot in their community exposed, filed back into the courtroom after less than an hour. They did not look at the defendants. Their foreman, the blacksmith Jedediah, stood, his large, calloused hands resting on the rail of the jury box. He looked the judge in the eye. "We find the defendants, Silas Mott and Ephraim Pike, guilty," he said, his voice a low, rumbling thunder that needed no amplification. "Guilty on all counts." A wave of catharsis washed through the courtroom, a collective exhalation of breath, a smattering of applause that quickly grew into a roar, punctuated by a few raw, relieved sobs. Judge Cormac let the noise continue for a full minute before his gavel brought a semblance of order. He sentenced Pike to 20 years of hard labor for his betrayal of the public trust. Then he turned his gaze, cold and hard as iron, upon Silas Mott. "For your crimes against the citizens of this territory," the judge declared, his voice ringing with the weight of righteous authority. "For the buying and selling of human souls, this court sentences you to hang by the neck until you are dead." Before Mott could be dragged away, the judge ordered the bailiffs to bring forth the evidence box. From it, he took the ledger and the various metal embossers and stamps Pike and Mott had used to legitimize their crimes, the thorny spur, the public security authorization seal. He carried them himself out to the top step of the courthouse, the entire town following him into the bright, clean sunlight. He handed the iron seals to Jedediah. "These are instruments of evil," the judge said, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. "They are lies made into metal. They have no place in a just society." Jedediah took them. He placed the first seal on the stone step. He did not use a small hammer. He raised his massive forging hammer, the one he used to shape raw iron, high above his head. The crowd held its breath. The hammer came down with a sound like a thunderclap. A single, explosive blow that shattered the intricate metal seal into a dozen unrecognizable pieces. He smashed the second, and then the third, each blow an exclamation point on the verdict. A physical act of destroying the machinery of oppression. When he was finished, he swept the twisted, broken shards of metal into the dust of the street, where they were trodden underfoot. The network of the Bramble Riders was officially and symbolically erased. Back inside the courthouse, in the relative quiet, the judge performed one last act. He had a clerk draw up a new document on clean, crisp legal paper. It was a writ of manumission and nullification. He signed it with a flourish, then took a stick of red wax, melted it with a candle flame, and pressed his official judicial seal into the soft, warm pool. The seal hardened, a bright red star of absolute finality. He called Lydia forward. She approached the bench, her steps steady. Gabe stood a respectful distance behind her, a silent, supportive presence. The judge held out the paper to her. "Miss Vale," he said, and his voice, for the first time, held a note of profound gentleness. "By the authority of this court and the laws of this territory, this document declares that the fraudulent bill of sale bearing your name is, and has always been, null and void. It declares that you are, and have always been, a free woman, beholden to no one but God and your own conscience." Lydia took the paper. She looked at the elegant script, the judge's bold signature, and the bright, perfect star of the red wax seal. This was not just a piece of paper. It was her life, given back to her. It was the legal and moral weight of an entire community, pushing back against the darkness she had endured. She didn't cry. Her heart was too full for tears. She simply held the document, feeling its clean, solid weight in her hands, and gave the judge a nod of profound, silent gratitude. She was free, by the law, and in her soul. She turned and walked from the courthouse, out into the sun-drenched town square. The crowd parted for her, their faces a mixture of awe, respect, and a shared, communal relief. They saw not a victim, but a survivor who had been instrumental in her own salvation. There were cheers, soft weeping, and murmurs of, "God bless you, child." The celebration was for the town, but the reverence was for her. She saw Gabe standing in the middle of it all, waiting. The raw wound on his arm had been bandaged, but he looked weary, the lines around his eyes etched deep by the ordeal. He was the eye of the storm, a point of stillness in the swirling emotion of the crowd. Lydia walked directly to him, her path cleaving the crowd in two. The noise around them seemed to fade into a distant hum. There was only him. She stopped in front of him, so close she could see the dust from the riverbank still on his shirt. She looked up into his face, into the eyes that had first shown her a kindness she had forgotten could exist. She held up the official document in one hand. "You've paid," she said, her voice a quiet murmur meant only for him, echoing her first, desperate words to him at the crumbling stone well. She took a small breath, her gaze holding his, her past and her future converging in this single, perfect moment. Today, do what must be done. A change came over Gabe's face. The weariness vanished, replaced by a look of brilliant, dawning clarity. A powerful, surging emotion rose in him, an excitement so pure and profound it seemed to light him from within. It was not the excitement of desire, but of destiny, recognized. He had lived for years in the shadow of a failure, defined by the family he had been too late to save. He had bought Lydia's contract as a desperate act of atonement, but now, standing before him was not a symbol of his past, but the living, breathing embodiment of his future. And she was choosing him, freely and openly, in front of the whole world. The debt of his past was finally, truly, paid, with all the solemnity of a prayer. Gabe Harrow went down on one knee in the dust of the Cormac town square. He took her free hand, the one that was not holding the writ of her freedom, in both of his. "Lydia Vale," he said, his voice rough with an emotion that transcended words. "You are the strongest, bravest person I have ever known. You saved my life, and you saved my soul." He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. "I am not asking to own you. I am asking to stand beside you, as your partner, as your equal, as your husband. Will you marry me?" For a moment, the world held its breath. Lydia looked down at the man kneeling before her, this quiet, honorable rancher who had seen her at her most broken and had shown her nothing but respect, who had seen her not as property, but as a person, from the very first. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, a smile of such pure, unadulterated joy that it seemed to outshine the sun. She gave a single, decisive nod. Gabe rose to his feet. He framed her face in his hands, and she rested her hands on his chest, over his heart, and there, in the center of the celebrating town, they kissed. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, abiding peace. It was a kiss of homecoming, a promise of shared sunrises and quiet strength, a gentle sealing of two broken souls now made whole. The crowd around them seemed to melt away, their cheers and applause becoming a soft, distant roar, like the sea. In that moment, they were the only two people on earth. From the edge of the crowd, Constance Rook watched them, a rare, genuine smile on her face. Her job was done. Justice had been served. She reached into her coat, took out the small, silver Pinkerton badge, and tucked it away. She was a schoolteacher again. With a final, satisfied look at the couple silhouetted against the afternoon sun, she turned and blended seamlessly into the dispersing crowd, a ghost of justice vanishing as quietly as she had appeared. The church bell, which had been tolling for victory, now began to ring in a joyful, celebratory peal, and as if in answer, from the high pasture beyond the town, came the lowing of the cattle herd, a deep, resonant chorus that was the wild, untamed music of the West itself. It was a symphony of freedom. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, bathing the juniper brakes in a spectacular fire of crimson and gold, Gabe and Lydia stood on the porch of the log cabin. Gabe brought the heavy, iron-banded chest out from his room. He knelt and unlocked it. The contents were sparse now. He reached in and took out the tarnished ranger's badge, holding it in his palm for a moment. It was no longer a symbol of failure, but a part of a past he had now made peace with. He set it on the porch railing. He looked back into the chest. At the bottom lay a small, gray pile of ash, the last mortal remains of the lie that had brought them together. The past, with all its ghosts and all its pain, was finally laid to rest. He closed the lid. Lydia came and stood beside him. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. They stood there for a long moment, watching the sky burn, the future an open, unwritten page before them. Then, together, they stepped off the porch and began to walk out towards the open range, their intertwined hands a silent promise, their silhouettes merging into one against the vast, magnificent, and unforgiving beauty of the sunset. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We're curious. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to connect and hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider supporting us further by hitting the hype button. It helps more than you know, and allows these stories to be heard by a wider audience.